What does one even say about a movie like the LA AIDS Jabber? A product that is a pure encapsulation of the concept of the innate punk ideals of horror, that may at least have been in part a total accident on the behalf of the creator. And at the end of the day, does that even actually matter? It is the only film that was either written or directed by actor-turned-filmmaker Drew Godaris, who, for the most part, is a total enigma beyond my understanding. I found very little about the dude online besides the fact that he used a career in acting in low-budget exploitation films to make the leap into writing and directing his own before fading back into total obscurity again. I know that he is straight or possibly bi. I know that he was married to a woman before she tragically passed, which is important to mention here and is also a really fascinating detail that we'll get to momentarily. And I know that he is seen wearing a cross necklace in the only filmed interview with him that I've ever seen, which seems to imply that he is presumably a Christian. Both of which kind of inform how we have to go about viewing this film and the very heavy symbols and language that he's throwing around here. Now, I do find it funny that Godaris has said that he wanted to make a film that was provocative, but ultimately one that didn't make a single audience member feel alienated. Which is why he made the decision for the film to not directly mention the sexuality of any of its characters at any point in the film. Any semblance of queerness is erased from the surface of the story, but just by using AIDS in LA in the 90s is such a charged visual idea that it permeates over the film, making the work by proxy a queer work of cinema even if it was not deliberately made to be as such and actively avoids the use of such language. Every actor in the film exudes gay energy, and I wouldn't be surprised to learn at all if the majority of the cast were queer in some form or another. Our supposedly straight twink protagonist cries in bed with blood dried to his face while exposing his shaved armpits, and walks around in designer jeans with no shirt on for like half the scenes. And this idea that is never outright stated begins to linger in your mind about the implication that one might be seen as gay in a time that was exceptionally hostile to that idea, as Jeff tries to figure out how he even contracted HIV in the first place, and the health department representative barges into his home to demand to learn if he has AIDS, saying to him over and over again, "The county has the right to know." And in all of this, even if he didn't mean to do it, Godaris inadvertently makes a film that harnesses gay rage in the midst of the AIDS crisis, where Jeff, after being infected, takes vials of his own blood and terrorizes the city by injecting anyone who he deems as even remotely moderately responsible for this death sentence that has been unjustly delivered onto his doorstep. He tells people as he stabs them, "Welcome to the AIDS Club." And I really wish that this had been more well seen by a certain demographic in that contemporary time period of when this was made. Because despite any inaccuracies that Godaris injects into the film, such as HIV diagnoses that come back positive the very same day as infections, the actual meat of this thing really could have been a very unifying symbol of what a lot of people were feeling in the mid-90s. AIDS stories written in the time of the height of AIDS are a big interest of mine actually. And if you watch this and are wanting other examples that filter that anger through a queer, somewhat horror perspective to explore in your own time, I would recommend you seek out Closer by Dennis Cooper, Rent Boy by Gary Indiana, or Rat Bohemia by Sarah Schulman. All three are excellent texts that can be seen as primary sources of what the cultural mood was like in that moment of time. If you've ever seen it before, this can almost be viewed as a spiritual sister to the masterpiece Reflections of Evil, which I think is one of the best films made in the past 20 or so years that we're going to be taking a look at on the main channel soon. And so if you've never heard of that and want to check that out before we get there, I'd recommend you look into it. But a lot of the thematic visual motifs of that work about the totality of evil baked into the very foundations, functions, and aesthetics of the American Empire are present here as well. And in that, demonstrate a deliberate attempt to build a thematic tied narrative. One can look at a film like the LA AIDS Jabber and write it off as just unpolished slop. But if you actually try and discern the intention of what led this person to picking up a camera in the first place, you may discover that there's a lot more layers to something that many would deem as garbage without a second glance. Homeless people and sex shops can be found on every corner of this nightmare rendition of LA. A woman cries alone in her room after being infected, only for us to smash cut to a clear image of the Hollywood sign. This is filmmaking. This is craft. And while a lot of it isn't traditionally executed, there's a distinct motivation as to why someone would make a movie that looks and feels like this does in the year 1994. It is a man taking a camera and using horror as a tool of artistry to say something about what he doesn't like about the world that he found himself standing in the midst of. Which to that I would ask, what more inhabits the pure ideals of the genre than that? And while some of it may have been clumsy, possibly even harmful in its attempt to not offend anybody, or even unintentionally brilliant on a conscious level, it is undeniable, I think, that what they were doing here is one of the best, most unique, and true-to-form uses of horror as social commentary of that decade. And the fact that it didn't get its time in the sun in that day and instead had to wait until the past several years to be reappraised, I think is a shame. But also, not all that surprising. In fact, this initial run of VHS copies that were distributed back in 1994 were the only way that one could watch the film for decades, until Visual Vengeance resurrected the film with a Blu-ray restoration in 2021. Now, even post-restoration, which, believe it or not, is the footage that you are seeing here today, the film may be among the worst looking ever made. It is genuinely impressively bad at times, which is all the more compelling because every 20 minutes or so they'll throw a curveball at you in the form of a great looking shot. And this does occasionally add to the film, such as the scene where Jeff contemplates taking his own life after being given his diagnosis that evokes the feeling of footage that you watched with your friends back in middle school that you had no business looking at. But all of this is not entirely their fault. The budget of the movie was $6,000. That was all that they had, and they initially did actually plan to shoot the project on film. But on the second or third day of production, the camera broke, and they were left with the decision to shell out a ton of money to either fix it or buy another, or to just shoot the whole project on videotapes, which is the one they clearly went with. That $6,000 also had to incorporate the distribution of the film, which Godaris handled entirely himself, printing the VHS copies one by one and placing them in their own custom-designed box that was then sent out to rental stores around the country that Godaris had personally contacted to sell copies to. There's a real initiative nature down to the very bones of this thing that I admire incredibly. He'd go out with unpaid actors on weekends and shoot scenes without permits. It's grunge, and punk in a way that is great to see. And speaking of selling movies himself to individual stores that would even stock it, it was in this time that he changed the title of the film to just The Jabber, out of a fear that nobody would buy or rent a film with a title like the one that they had shot the project under. Which, is a concern that makes sense, but also is a bit sad because the LA AIDS Jabber is easily one of the hardest titles in horror film history. But this is all said before the downside of this whole thing, in that as a work of filmic entertainment, this actually does little for me after it gets the ball rolling. We start with this genius opening of a kid who's just 18 years old, who has AIDS, and he's trying to figure out how in the hell this has even happened to him, and who is directly responsible so that he can take out his revenge for causing this. And then instead of getting to see that actually play out, we shift into a more traditional police procedural film about the LAPD trying to figure out who is doing this and how they can stop him. And it all just feels frustratingly unfocused. A protagonistless crawl that becomes near impossible to follow due to its poor writing mixed with the obvious production quality issues present from the first frame. But there's also something a little endearing in this as well, akin to the early work of John Waters. All of the actors deliver their lines in this folksy kind of Midwestern way of speaking, and not one of them feels as if they're native to the greater Los Angeles area, let alone are actually cops, reporters, or doctors, which creates this really surreal atmosphere as if the movie were made by people who weren't actually from America. It really gives that DIY Rudy Ray Moore kind of quality that is difficult to describe, but immediately understand when you're looking at it. And all of this together leaves me sitting with conflicted overall feelings about the film. For decades, queer people had to co-opt works of art as their own because there was not direct representation of queerness in the media. Basically, all of the films that are seen as gay camp classics don't actually have gay people in them for the most part, but there's this unifying theatrical appeal that sort of makes them gay by proxy, which is sort of a difficult concept to describe. I've had relatives ask me in earnest why Jennifer Coolidge is a gay icon when she isn't gay herself or a man. And to explain that kind of energy and admiration to someone on the outside of that initiated circle is actually quite difficult to put words to. It's like trying to explain why a meme is funny to someone who lacks the proper context of the culture that meme exists within. And to me, this idea is kind of somewhat related to the LA AIDS Jabber in a fundamental way. This movie that totally bucks its connection to queerness, that in all honesty was probably made as an anti-queer movie that uses the fear of gay blood to build this story, of spreading infection within a city, inadvertently sort of embraces the anger of a time that was justifiably angry. And in turn, whether it wanted to be or not, it becomes queer because of the cultural lens that one must view the film through. And I really don't think that Drew Godaris was actually setting out to do that at all. I think he just wanted to make a scary movie for $6,000, and AIDS was in the news every day, and he figured he could do something cheap with that. I don't know the intentions there, but based on what I've seen him say, I don't think he actually was trying to make an important film about the emotions of the gay perspective. But these are the things that are running through my mind when I think of this film and its complicated legacy that it's built for itself.